Before we start, I'd like to apologize to you for having to look at my ugly face here. I got in a car accident, so sorry about that. But I am here to talk about an important concept known as whiteness studies. Reading, upon reading this article and going through this class, I learned that studying whiteness as a concept is very important, especially after reading The Matter of Whiteness by Tammy Kennedy, Joyce Middleton, and Krista Ratcliffe. They really want us to think about how much race is tied up with language, with communication, even in ways we don't always realize. It's like we don't even think about it, it's just there. Because this goes beyond just talking about race. It goes into how deeply some ideas get embedded in our society, where you don't even see them. The article makes it really clear that we're not talking about biology here. It presents whiteness as a powerful theme, a recurring image in US language and culture, and it impacts everybody, regardless of your background. It says that this idea of whiteness has been built up over time, and it works as this kind of unspoken privilege norm, especially for people who are considered white. Kennedy and her fellow authors put it really well. They point out how whiteness, in this sense, often becomes invisible to those who actually embody it. Okay, to be clear, I'm not saying that every single white person automatically has privilege in every situation. It's more about how the idea of whiteness works within our society. And why is this? Well, they argue that US culture and the language we use is fundamentally shaped by race. And this directly challenges the idea that many like to believe that we should have a colorblind society. The idea that race really doesn't matter. And this sources suggest that whiteness studies give us the tools we need to look at race and whiteness together. Historically, conversations about race have often focused mostly on marginalized groups. And this field of study is saying, wait, hold on. We can't really understand race unless we also look at the role and function of whiteness. It makes sense to me, because otherwise it'd be like trying to figure out how the stock market works, but it's looking at the buyers and not the sellers. So you're missing a major part of something when you're ignoring something that shapes everything in our culture. Big takeaway is that language is the key to understanding whiteness in the US. Well, let's unpack that a little bit more. The article talks about words as tropes, the troping of bodies, and how these tropes get embodied, which all sounds kind of abstract. I know it did to me. And while it can sound abstract, the idea itself, if you just look at it a little bit closer, it starts to make more sense. The authors basically point to these three ways language is connected to whiteness, and they all work together. The first key thing is that words, even words that seem pretty neutral, actually act like tropes. They're powerful figures of speech with all this history and cultural meaning about race baked right into them. And here's what understanding the definition of trope is really important. It's more than just a word, it's a rhetorical figure, a concept that represents something bigger and evolves over time. And it comes with this big pile of historical baggage. Okay, so the article says that race and whiteness function as these kind of tropes. So it's like when we use certain words and talking about race and whiteness, we're not just describing something objectively, we're bringing all this extra historical weight, all the baggage that comes with any particular word or saying, phrase. So if we're saying that words have this power to shape how we think about race, then what about the next piece, the troping of bodies? Well, that's the second part that the authors speak of. It builds on the idea that race is not a biological truth. It's something that we make up. And the fascinating thing here is how we use language and all these cultural stories to actually create and reinforce ideas about different bodies based on race. And these aren't based on some inherent difference, but on, social agreements and how power is played out throughout history. How the media often portrays certain racial groups in specific ways, even if it seems harmless. These repeated portrayals contribute to this troping of those bodies. And then the third piece the authors speak of is how these tropes become embodied. And what does that actually look like in real life? Well, this means that all these linguistic and social tropes about race and whiteness, they don't just stay abstract. They become part of our lived experience. They shape how we see each other, how we treat each other, and even how we see ourselves. These deeply ingrained ideas can influence everything from like little everyday interactions we have amongst each other to the big social structures that dominate our society. For example, there's a societal trope that links intelligence with whiteness, and that can lead to lower expectations for students of color, which directly affects their education. That's a trope that has become embodied and has real world consequences. So basically, the way we talk about race can actually impact people's opportunities and experiences. Yeah, that's right. And the disadvantage is faced by people of color. The authors keep coming back to this idea of race as social construct.
How many
hear that a lot?
The authors called it critical consciousness.
What does it actually
similar
mean
to Freir's idea
in this context?
It's led me to a much better understanding of the systemic barriers that people of color
pretty
face.
clear about
and the
this.
importance of things
Race
like
has
diversity,
absolutely no
equity,
basis
and inclusion
in biology.
It's a
No
great
gene
example of how
or set of
examining whiteness
genes
can actually help us
that neatly
understand the
divides people into
complexities
distinct racial
of inequality
categories
for everyone, not just specific
but
groups.
this is the crucial part.
By understanding
Even
the
though
role
it's
that
not
whiteness plays,
biological,
we can actually work
race
towards a
has
more
a
equitable
huge
society for
cultural,
everyone.
political, and
That's the
ideological
idea.
power.
So to wrap things up,
The piece even touches
there's
on
some
how
key
these
takeaways
racial ideas developed over
we should
time.
remember after this
It
trip into
mentions
whiteness
an old
studies.
theory,
The
known
main
as the
message
five
from these
races of man
sources
theory.
is that whiteness is much more
was one
than
of
just
the
a simple biological category. It's this really powerful cultural trope.
big theories
It
that
shapes
try
how we
to
see race and
separate
how we function in U.S. society,
people
and
by
how our
race.
language works.
And
Understanding whiteness is
it was
absolutely
believed
crucial
for a long
for
time. It
really
still
grasping how
dominates
race
our society.
works.
There's still
It
people
challenges
who
the simple idea of a
believe that
colorblind
to this day.
society, just pretending that the idea of race doesn't exist. The article
Well, this is
encourages
just
all
one
of us to
example of
develop
how
this deeper,
people have made
more
up these
critical
concepts
awareness
and use them to
of these
justify putting
ingrained
people into
dynamics that are all
hierarchies.
around us, which was my goal today. To give us this
section
quick
of
but
so-
thorough understanding
on
of the
social
key ideas of
construction of
whiteness
race
studies
as
as
presented
presented
in
in
an
an
article.
article.
Social, cultural,
And here's a final
political,
thought
and
for you to
historical
ponder.
forces.
Given this idea
Even though
of
it's made
whiteness
up,
as a
its
social
impact on individuals
construct,
and
it's always
society
being
is
shaped
very
by
real.
language and culture. So
For
for
race
being
is something
more aware of
we've
this concept
essentially
actually
invented.
empower people to
Why
actively change
is
the
whiteness
conversation
studies so important?
and
For
challenge
feels
those
like
existing
rhetoric
power
imposition
dynamics within their own
Well, the
communities
study of
and
writing
their own actions.
and
I think
communication.
that's something for all of us to
That's
think
everything,
about.
right? Our writing, our how we communicate, if these tropes are embedded in the language, and we just accept them, how's anything ever going to change? The article makes a really compelling case that looking through the lens of whiteness studies can totally change how we approach writing. By recognizing that all U.S. cultural language carries like these racial undertones, we can be much more critical about how we analyze and create communication. It's about going deeper than the surface meaning of language and seeing the power dynamics that are always at play. And even more than that, the authors suggest that this perspective has the potential to actually shift how we talk about race in general. So instead of always focusing on marginalized groups, it allows us to include whiteness as an equally important area of study. And that could lead to a much more complete and nuanced understanding of how all these racial dynamics work. At least it seems like to me. This kind of approach might not be welcomed by everyone, though. And the authors preemptively address some of the common questions, criticisms that they probably hear a lot. And they want to get ahead of it. And what do you think's behind that? Well, at its heart, whiteness studies is asking us to really question the established ways of thinking about race. It asks us to examine the role of a group that has historically been considered the norm. Basically the default setting. And often without facing the same level of scrutiny as other groups. And understandably, that can lead to some discomfort or skepticism from people on both sides of the issue. Some might feel like that unfairly targets white people, while others worry that it will distract from the experiences of people of color. And the fact that the authors anticipated these concerns and addressed them head on suggests that they understand how sensitive and potentially controversial this area of study can be. So they frame it more as starting a conversation, but recognizing that it might be a tough one for some people to have. And I know as I've been going along this class, I've doing our weekly assigned readings, they all tend to kind of connect, tell a story of race and the different marginalized groups, particularly in the U.S. One that stood out to me that was really connected to whiteness studies was education and Paulo Freire's work and his critique, particularly of the banking model of education. Let me break down that connection for you. Freire was very critical of this model of education, where students were basically treated like empty vessels. just passively receiving information like deposits in a bank. That's why it's called the banking model. That's where you just memorize information and repeat it by rote. You're not really learning. You're just repeating what you heard, parroting. And Ferg believes that that way of teaching actually prevents students from developing what he calls critical consciousness and encourages them to just accept the world as it is. And applying this banking model of education to the study of race, especially whiteness, can be really problematic. And it's been going on for decades. The same systemic prejudices just repeated throughout the decades to each generation of kids. The education system is just starting to take a look at correcting this. And who knows, hopefully in the future, it'll develop and come to an equilibrium where it's balanced. As for now, just giving students, especially white students, information about race, but without encouraging them to critically examine their own place in relation to whiteness, is basically just continuing the same path learning we've been on. Authors of The Matter of Whiteness are saying it's not enough to just learn about the history of racism. Contrast this passive approach with a problem-posing or critical approach, which is what whiteness studies encourage. This approach is all about getting students to ask questions about what they're learning, to really analyze the power structures that are underneath everything, and to understand how whiteness operates in society, including how it might affect their own views and experiences. It's about getting a much deeper and more critical engagement with the material. This makes me think of how this plays out in the real world. Reading some concepts as the racial projects, which are written about in Racial Formation in the United States by Omi and Wynant. They define a racial project as something that's racist if it creates or strengthens the systems of domination. That's the key word. And how does whiteness studies fit in with that idea? Well, these systems are based on essentialist ideas about race. Meaning it's just, they're there. Each race has its own qualities and bad things, but which we've learned isn't true. And what's really interesting is how whiteness studies gives us a way to see how whiteness often operates as this dominant and seemingly neutral force. But with these studies, it's like making the invisible visible, and that gives us the tools to understand how these structures of domination can be maintained, even without people intentionally being racist or doing prejudicial things. It's about looking at the system itself, not just individual actions. So even if you don't think you're actually participating in racism, the system itself might be perpetuating it, right? On a personal note, I can share my perspective. As a 43-year-old white college student who's also an ex-felon who's trying to get his life together. I initially believed in being colorblind and, every man's the same and the person's a person. That was kind of my outlook. But as I've gone through these past 2 years trying to stay out of prison and start a new life and a path in higher education, I've changed my outlook pretty dramatically. And for me, my experience makes these abstract ideas concrete. I went through some tough times economically because I had been incarcerated. And at first, I was all about everyone gets an opportunity, everyone can do it, the race doesn't matter. But by looking at my own experience with systemic disadvantages, I started to see where that's wrong. And I see the value of whiteness studies. I realize that even within the category of white, there are still power dynamics and inequalities, though I do acknowledge that these are often experienced differently and less severely than the disadvantages faced by people of color. My experiences, along with some serious self-reflection, helped me to develop what the authors called a critical consciousness, which is similar to Freir's idea. This led me to a much better understanding of the systemic barriers that people of color face, and the importance of things like diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. It's a great example of how examining whiteness can actually help us understand the complexities of inequality for everyone, not just specific groups. So by understanding the role that whiteness plays, we can actually work towards a more equitable society for everyone. And that's the idea. So to wrap things up, here's some key takeaways you should remember after this trip into whiteness studies. The main message from these sources is that whiteness is much more than just a simple biological category. It's this really powerful cultural trope. This shapes how we see race and how we function in U.S. society and how our language works. Understanding whiteness is absolutely crucial for really grasping how race works. It challenges the simple idea of a colorblind society, just pretending that the idea of race doesn't exist. The article encourages all of us to develop this deeper, more critical awareness of these ingrained dynamics that are all around us, which is my goal today. To give us this quick but thorough understanding of the key ideas of whiteness studies as presented in our article. And here's a final thought for you to ponder. Given this idea of whiteness as a social construct that's always being shaped by language and culture, how might being more aware of this concept actually empower people to actively change the conversation and challenge those existing power dynamics within their own communities and their own actions? I think that's something for all of us to think about.